Welcome, I'm Nina Griffin, and this is the Astrology and Magic channel. This is going to be a special video where I talk about the year ahead 2022, the astrological forecast for the year. First off, I wanted to say thank you to all of my patrons. I really appreciate all of your support, conversation, and inspiration. If you would like to join my Patreon and get access to videos that are not available to the public, as well as videos that are available earlier to the patrons than to the general public, you can go to patreon.com/NinaGriffin. So first off, talking about 2022, this video is intended to be an overview. It's going to be pretty high level, just to give us an idea of some of the trends and the big picture changes that are coming up. There are going to be other videos coming out in the weeks ahead where I talk about certain individual elements of 2022 that deserve special attention. For example, the Jupiter-Neptune conjunction, Jupiter as it switches between Pisces and Aries. We're definitely going to talk about the eclipses, the Aries ingresses and the other ingresses as well, and much more. However, I wanted to give you a video that shows how all of this ties together and give you a sense of the themes and overarching ideas that we're going to experience. The thing to remember about 2022 is that while it's not a perfect year, I don't think such a year has happened yet in human history or even Earth history, it's certainly a milder and gentler year than 2021 and certainly 2020. So if you would think about the progression of the years, 2020 would probably be the absolute rock bottom terribleness that we saw with Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto all in Capricorn, wreaking incredible havoc on the entire world. 2021 was a step away from that. Lots of planets, including Jupiter, Saturn, moved into Aquarius, and so we got a nice sort of separation between 2020 and 21. We were still dealing with the Saturn-Uranus square in 21, which is very difficult, even in the easiest of times, and these times are anything but easy. In 2022, that Saturn-Uranus square begins to separate, and we'll talk about kind of its special implications in 2022 as well. But there are also some really nice things happening astrologically in 22 that seem to start to kind of heal some of the bad things that we saw in 2020 and 21. All right, so let's get started. I'm going to talk about the year in quarters, so first quarter, second, third, and fourth quarter. That gives us a nice separation of the different parts of the year and gives us a sense of a narrative from beginning to end. The first quarter, I call this quarter Greater Good is Lost and Then Regained. We have Saturn and Jupiter entering the beams of the Sun this quarter, and each of them reemerges about a month later. Saturn enters the beams January 19th and reemerges February 21st, and then Jupiter, right after that, enters the beams February 20th and reemerges March 18th. So what's interesting this year is that Jupiter and Saturn, which are the most important visible planets because they're the slowest moving, and therefore they show the largest changes in society, the biggest shifts, both psychologically but also economically and socially in other ways. So when they're doing something interesting like going under the beams and reemerging, we know that there are some interesting and pretty dramatic changes afoot. So this year, Jupiter and Saturn enter the beams and emerge sequentially. First, Saturn goes into that purifying solar furnace, he emerges, and then it's Jupiter's turn. So when Saturn is under the beams, the serious, more structural and restrictive elements in our lives and in society go into the shop for a tune-up. It's a temporary state of things, but it's still noticeable. This tends to depress appetite for restrictions, but also depresses the appetite for more sensible limitations that are necessary. When Jupiter goes into the furnace, then we see a diminution of generosity to the public, a diminution in public funding, legal matters, which are also ruled by Jupiter. All of this goes underground for a while. It's not so much that these matters are permanently destroyed, although that can happen too. It's more that these matters go in for some kind of retooling where they're often out of the public eye. Remember that a planet under the beams is not visible to the naked eye due to the incredible glare from the sun, which obscures any planets that are near the sun at that time. This quarter, we're also going to see a lot of discussion or controversy over crime and punishment. This is because Mars will enter Capricorn in late January, just as Venus will go direct in Capricorn. So Capricorn is going to be an active place in the early part of Q1. Now, we're going to definitely revisit issues of justice and racial equity in the criminal and law enforcement systems. It's also going to be an opportunity for people to rethink how they are dealing with the pandemic and with COVID, because as you know, of course, Capricorn was probably the #1 sign that was activated in 2020 as the pandemic started, first in China and then later elsewhere in the world. The Capricorn ingress, which technically starts at the end of December, this determines the trends and events for the winter season. It's a 3-month chart. And this ingress, even though the planets are all going to be in the same sign and degree of the sign, regardless of where you cast that chart in the world, they are going to be in different houses. So I'm going to speak about these trends more generally in a way that are applicable. So the Capricorn ingress has the moon in Cancer opposite Venus retrograde in Capricorn. So I think there is a real sense of public dissatisfaction with issues of tolerance and equity. And I think there's also a feeling that the idea of reconciliation must be somehow brought back to life. There is a sense that we've moved away from our ideals as societies about how we treat other people especially who are different from ourselves. And so there is a sense of dissatisfaction that this hasn't been handled appropriately. So then the question is, do we throw out the baby with the bathwater, or are we going to retool what we have to try to improve it? Now at this time as well, Jupiter will sextile Uranus, which gives us, I think, a foretaste of the very powerful and very beneficial configurations of the mid to late 2020s, when Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto are all going to be harmoniously aligned for several years. So with Jupiter being in Pisces, it starts to give us a little bit of that foretaste, which we've not really seen, about what's going to happen in a few years. So it's going to be an interesting year in the sense that it's just like a little teaser of what's going to happen a few years from now. Now, remember that early 2022 is still going to be influenced by the separating Saturn-Uranus square that happened in late December 21. So we're still going to be resolving issues around the struggle between totalitarianism on the one side of the spectrum and anarchy on the other. So those themes are still echoing through 2022, not as strongly as in 21. It's almost like the first salvos were struck in 21, and then 22 are kind of the echoes of how you deal with the aftermath. Also, we're going to be coming off of the latest big COVID wave, because that Saturn-Uranus aspect tends to trigger spikes in infection rates during pandemics or epidemics. The second quarter in many ways is going to be the most fascinating and dramatic. I called it the return of scary season with a twist. I think in some ways, this quarter may be a reminder of some of the early days of the pandemic, especially in the Western world. It could be perhaps an onrush of new cases somewhere like Asia or India, somewhere really big. But the twist here is that this may actually lead to a great act of generosity, cooperation, and coordination between governments or between large entities. So it's kind of a coin with two sides. The reason for this is that Mars will conjoin Saturn in Aquarius, similar to the Mars-Saturn conjunction we saw in Aquarius in March 2020 when the lockdown started in the West. Now, in the Aries ingress chart, which is the chart that shows us the trends for the following 3 months and basically forecasts events of the spring season, Venus in Aquarius is going to be besieged by Mars and Saturn. Besiegement is one of those things that even very beginning astrologers learn to recognize very quickly. It's where you have two malefic planets, typically Mars and Saturn, and there's another planet that's sort of the filling in that terrible sandwich. And that planet, of course, is considered to be besieged or harmed because it's got a malefic planet on each side. So this Aries ingress certainly indicates that harmony, which is Venus, could be hard to achieve. And in general, because of that Mars-Saturn conjunction, the world will be under a great deal of pressure this quarter. Now, speaking of the Aries ingress, there is another much more favorable aspect happening, and that's the Mercury conjunction with Jupiter in Pisces. And this combination, I think, is very sensitive, very humanitarian. Sometimes it's religious or spiritual, but it's not always fact-based. With Jupiter in Pisces, as I've explained elsewhere, there is always the danger of taking things on faith too much and engaging in magical thinking, pretending that things are better than they really are. Now, especially with Mercury in Pisces, the sign of Mercury's detriment and fall, there is a tendency to put faith over facts. Now, this quarter as well, Jupiter will conjoin Neptune, and that will happen only once this year. This is an aspect that, on the one hand, it's said to be an epidemic breeder, and I'm quoting George J. McCormack, who is a famous astrological weather forecaster. He also talked about epidemics in the first half of the 20th century. That said, this combination is nothing like the Saturn-Uranus combination in terms of power and scope that we saw in 2021. But we might see an upsurge in cases in some places. What's interesting is that on the political and social side, Jupiter conjunct Neptune is also strongly associated with humanistic and humanitarian urges and movements. So this combination tends to be related to a political and diplomatic détente and humanitarian initiatives that span many countries or even the entire world. But, of course, because it's a tough season, we may only get to this really nice agreement through undergoing some suffering first. On the market side, and this I think deserves its own video, we're going to see some interesting movements in the stock markets and equities markets and just generally the markets in general. There could be some frothiness because as Jupiter conjoins Neptune, they will also conjoin the very old chart MC of the New York Stock Exchange. And this is a very, very old chart that dates back to the very early days of New York City when Wall Street literally was just some people meeting under a tree. What's interesting is that Neptune is conjoining that MC of that chart for the first time since 1861. If you know American history, 1861 is a very important year because it marked the beginning of the Civil War. In the markets at the same time, there was depression, or there was a market panic called the Secession Depression, because it has to do with the threat and actually the fact of multiple southern states seceding from the Union. This, along with Neptune conjoining the MC of the New York Stock Exchange, led to a market rout. Now, obviously, I think we're going to be in for some interesting times in the markets because this is such a rare aspect. It takes many years for it to come around again. So going back to 1861, we're going to see some pretty fascinating shifts, I think, in overall market trends. Now, Jupiter will sextile Pluto in this quarter, again previewing some of those configurations that we're going to see in the mid to late 2020s. These configurations are largely favorable, so it's hard to say that this quarter is going to be all bad. Quite the opposite. There's going to be a lot of opportunity for pretty major transformations that seed positive changes that will come to fruition maybe several years from now. There are going to be a couple of solar eclipses in this quarter as well. There is particularly a fascinating solar eclipse April 30th, and I think it's just going to offer an incredible opportunity for growth and for peace as well as coordination. The ruler of this eclipse is going to be Venus, and she's going to be exalted in Pisces, exactly conjunct Jupiter in Pisces. It's a major configuration that doesn't come around all that often, and I think it's going to give us a real peek into some of the good things that could happen if people find a way forward together. There's also a May 15th eclipse, which I think is less dramatic, and it's going to be more restrained, whether for good or for evil. This quarter as well, Jupiter will enter Aries, offering us a much more energetic and much more intense can-do approach to doing good and improving the world. Certainly compared to Jupiter in Pisces, which just wants to relax, have fun, and take it on faith that everything's going to be okay, Jupiter in Aries really wants to do something about it. Finally, this quarter is capped off with Saturn turning retrograde, again temporarily dropping some boundaries that perhaps were necessary or perhaps are seen as too oppressive. The third quarter, I named it quiet in response to Q2. This is going to be a quarter that's relatively less busy astrologically. Jupiter turns retrograde in late July, so some of the generosity and initiatives that we saw in the second quarter are now being re-examined and rethought after the initial outpouring of sympathy and enthusiasm. The Cancer ingress, which puts its imprint on the summer season, has Moon conjoining Jupiter in Aries and sextile Mercury. This is generally good for the general mood optimism and energetic movement forward. Now, Mars will also be in Aries. It's going to be a bit of a wide conjunction between Mars and Jupiter. Because Mars is present there as well, there is a tendency to be a little bit overly militant in certain things. However, overall, this is a very optimistic and positive ingress. It's better than what we've seen in, frankly, a few years now. Saturn and Uranus will also get within a few degrees of each other again and stay within a small range really through December, so for the second half of 2022. They will never complete or perfect their aspect the way that we saw in 2021, but they're going to get very close, and the second half of 22 may feel like an echo of 21. They're going to be the closest in October 2022 as well as November. Most likely, this means that the second half of 22 will lead to an increase in COVID cases, again due to that Saturn-Uranus connection with epidemic illness. Remember, Saturn and Uranus can also lead to geopolitical hijinks and boundary testing. Certainly, we're going to see some testing of political and social boundaries within countries and also internationally among countries. The fourth quarter, I called it cautious positivity and firm pushback. Now, this quarter will have Mars turning retrograde in late October, and this can often bring a sense of freedom and liberation from people, groups, social influences who were previously aggressive, disruptive, or violent. Saturn will turn direct near the same time, giving us a real opportunity to push back against bullying or overbearing behavior. Certainly, people or movements who have been very martial in their behavior will start to stumble around this time, and there's going to be a real sense of, sorry, you can't cross this particular line. Now, the Libra ingress, which governs the last 3 months of the year, has the moon on Regulus opposing Saturn in Aquarius. So there is a desire for chest beating, for conquest. Sometimes this is associated with nationalism, things that have to do with pride. However, these tendencies are held in check by Saturn opposition, so likely this type of behavior or these tendencies kind of go nowhere. There may be frustration, but ultimately it kind of just fizzles out. Now, the ingress also has Mercury in Libra conjunct the Sun, and they both oppose Jupiter in Aries. I think there's going to be a lot of drama around legal matters, around the judicial system, around the courts, as well as issues involving big business and education, as these are all related to Mercury as well as Jupiter. There will certainly be a sense that structure and accountability are returning after a period of uncertainty or a period of too great of an optimistic approach. Saturn and Uranus will still be very close to a partile square, though they do never complete it. And this, I think, tends to make people very fearful overall, whether they're fearful of COVID, they're fearful of crime, they're fearful of refugees, whatever it is, there's going to be a sense of fear. And so I think people are going to be looking for a place to put that fear. They're going to look for an image of that fear. Certainly, I think generally, people will be looking for security, predictability, not disruption. We do have a pair of eclipses in October and November, and they are both strongly influenced by Venus, which means that they will bring an opportunity for everyone to simmer down and find a compromise path forward. Right now, people just want to enjoy things. They've been through a lot in the last few years, and so there's a sense that we want to find a way forward together in a way that is the least disruptive to society and the least harmful to everyone involved. So to summarize, it's going to be a fascinating year, generally much more positive and optimistic than we've seen since 2020 and 2021. It's definitely a sense of an upswing, and we're going to get a preview of some of the major configurations that are going to be so important in the middle of the 2020s as well as in the later part of the decade. I think it's going to be fascinating just to see what some of these trends are going to be and how they're going to play out in society. All right, thanks for watching. Remember to watch the other videos that I'm going to be publishing about some of the details of 2022 in the weeks ahead. I'm Nina Griffin, and this is the Astrology and Magic channel.